Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Authors on Mission podcast. Today, I want you to imagine that you're drowning in a 70-hour work week, your marriage is strained, and your life is like an endless cycle of meaningless tasks. Then, a mysterious envelope appears on your desk, a dinner invitation from someone claiming to be Jesus of Nazareth. Sounds like fiction, right? Well, our guest today, this fictional scenario became a 500,000 copy bestseller that launched an unexpected writing career at age 46. Welcome to Authors on Mission podcast, where we sit down with the visionaries who dare to write the impossible, challenge the conventional, and transform lives with the power of story. I'm your host, Danielle Hutchinson, Chief Creative Officer here at Authors on Mission, and today we're exploring the story of a man who's never intended to become a novelist, but ended up creating some of the most thought-provoking Christian fiction of our time. David Gregory didn't set out to conquer the New York Times bestseller list. He just wanted to print a few hundred copies of a story to share his faith. But of course, fate had other turns. He has a great book out now, and through faith, doubt, and what it really means to conquer the divine in our modern world, David Gregory is here to share all about it. So David, welcome to our show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm very excited to dive in and learn a little bit more about your story and, of course, the writing process as well. So I gave a little bit of background information about you, but I'm wondering if you'd like to fill in the blanks a little bit, get us to know a little bit more about who you are and what led you to writing this book.
Yeah, my path to writing was a little unusual. I didn't really start writing professionally until I was late 30s. And that was entirely nonfiction. I was actually writing position papers and short essay type material, and also some curriculum type work. So I never anticipated being a writer. I wasn't somebody who grew up composing stories. If I had to write a story because it was a school assignment, I would do it, and I'd be happy to do so. But I was always a good writer growing up, but it wasn't something that I did as a major hobby or ever envisioned myself doing. But I ended up going to Dallas Theological Seminary when I was about 40. And about that time, shortly before that, I approached a guy who had been a pastor from Kentucky. And his material I thought was so good that I just said, hey, I'd love to take some of your stuff. I'd gotten to know him over time and put it into book form. And he said, fine. So he sent me a bunch of audio tapes. This was back in 1999. So I transcribed and organized and wrote transitions and all of that and produced a book called The Rest of the Gospel. And I just self-published it. That was back when self-publishing meant going and finding an offset print company who actually would print a couple of thousand copies for you. So I had some copies, they were sitting in the garage, and I thought, well, if I sell 1,000 copies, I'll break even and hopefully it'll impact some lives. Well, I did almost nothing to promote the book, but it started catching on by word of mouth, and it ended up selling over 100,000 copies, which was pretty good for an unpromoted self-published book by an unknown author. Anyway, while I was at seminary, I took a creative writing class and then a creativity class. And I had an idea to write this little story about this man who was an agnostic skeptic in his mid to late 30s from Cincinnati, who received a dinner invitation to dine at a nice Italian restaurant with Jesus of Nazareth. And so I ended up finishing the story after seminary and self-publishing it as usual. And as you said, I just had, some copies on hand to give out to family and friends and people I might happen to meet that I thought would like the story. But I had a contact at Random House at Waterbrick Press, their Christian publishing division. So I just sent them a book, hey, I wrote this book, thought you might like to take a look at it. And so they ended up contacting me and said, we'd like to publish your book. So I just said, great. And so they signed me a contract and they were going to print 20,000 copies. It was just a standard industry contract. So that was great news from my end. Well, before they ended up releasing the book, they had printed 200,000 copies. And so they had to launch a fairly large marketing campaign to get rid of 200,000 print copies of this book. This was in 2005. And so it had its own write-up in the Wall Street Journal and USA Today and all this other marketing effort. And within a few weeks, it hit the New York Times extended bestseller list and ended up selling 500,000 copies. And all of a sudden, I had a fiction writing career dumped into my lap. Not only was I not a fiction author, I wasn't even a fiction reader. About 98% of everything I read is nonfiction. And so they wanted me to write more books, of course. So I said, fine. So we signed a big contract and I wrote a couple of sequels and so forth. And a movie producer from Louisville, an independent producer, called me and said, I wanted to make a movie of your book. This was back when it was just self-published. So I said, great. So we signed a contract. He made a movie. It sold tons of DVDs. It aired on Trinity. Is that what it's called? Trinity Broadcasting Network, TBN, yeah. 1 million times. It still does. So it was, for a little independent movie, it was very successful. He made another movie of the second one. He made a movie of the third book. And so this little 100-page novella that I wrote, that I just wanted some copies on hand for family and friends and people I met, ended up blossoming into this fiction writing career and selling oodles of copies and 3 movies and all of this. And so, needless to say, it turned into something way beyond what I had ever envisioned.
Well, wow, that's quite the tale, going from, something you never expected to this now. And I think then what struck me most about this is that you had no part to play in marketing or promoting the book. And yet, I mean, in the very first stages, like you mentioned, and it kind of just
Right.
traction. I'm wondering how. Just word of mouth. Did you have any part to play in that? I'm sure a lot of authors right now are curious and wanting to know.
Are you talking about what I said about my first, the first?
Yeah, very much before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The guy who was the primary author, his name is Dan Stone. He used to go around the country doing retreats and conferences, and so he had little pockets of people in a whole bunch of different places that really enjoyed his teaching. So I just got a hold of some of those by phone or email and said, hey, just wanted to let you know Dan Stone has a book out. And so really, that's about all I did. Well, with one exception, I think I hired a PR firm that set up a few radio interviews for me. And so I probably did, maybe 10 or 12 radio interviews. That was back when radio stations would actually interview authors and so forth. So that was really the extent of the marketing. I would say, 90% of the marketing came through word of mouth, totally apart from me. I think the radio interviews probably didn't have much impact. They never seemed to. And so really it was just me contacting some of these little groups and saying, Dan has a book out, and just word of mouth took it from there. And so it certainly surprised me for the book to be such a success, not because I thought it wasn't a great book. I thought it was, but simply because, I had no way to really promote it.
Understood. Well, hey, it's still amazing that it was able to gain such traction and lead you to where you are today based on all of that. So it's a great story. I think that's an inspiration for a lot of people listening today. But no, I'd love to transition and segue into some of your most recent books. I know, I believe it was One of Us is your most recent. Is that correct?
Yeah, here's a copy of One of Us. I came out with One of Us the last half of last year, and most of my fiction is Christian themed. And so this Dinner with a Perfect Stranger was certainly Christian themed. One of the 2 main characters was Jesus. And so this kind of falls into the same vein. I've had for 10 or 12 years a vision for this book. I wanted to take the 4 Gospels from the New Testament and essentially take a harmony of those Gospels as if it was one story and transpose it from first century Israel to 21st century America. And I wanted essentially to ask the question, what would it look like if Jesus, instead of coming to first century Israel, had come to our time and our place? And so the book starts where the Gospel of Mark starts, with a John the Baptist character. In this case, he's a Mexican preacher wading into the Rio Grande and saying, hey, a guy is coming, and he's going to be God's Messiah. So he attracts a following. And the Jesus character, his name is Manuel. He is a auto mechanic from McAllen, Texas. And he goes to the river and is baptized, and the Holy Spirit descends on him. And basically, the book just takes the story of the four Gospels and goes all the way through Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So I tend to write things, as I said, with Christian themes that are kind of outside the box. My hope is that people will read them and they will be challenged in their thinking, they'll be challenged in their faith, and they'll be challenged to consider who Jesus is in a way that maybe they've never really thought of before. So in this case, by putting Jesus in the present tense in our culture and having him, relating to software engineers and truck drivers and, accountants rather than fishermen and shepherds from the first century, it has a different feel to it. So that's the intention behind the book, and so far among the people who have read it, it seems to have accomplished what I wanted it to accomplish. The people that have read it who have talked to me said, man, that really brought the person of Christ alive to me in a way that I haven't experienced before in quite that way. And so that's very heartening to hear.
Right. Well, thank you for giving the overview of that book. I can see that it really is something that challenges people to think and to reassess their beliefs. In fact, when I was looking up information about your book, you actually mentioned one of the quotes is, it's called the most consequential Christian fiction in the last 2 decades, which is a really bold claim and wonderful. So I'm wondering, what specific controversial choices did you make when you were writing this book? Anything that might surprise the readers more so than others that you might want to give a little hint about now?
Well, some readers will be surprised that the Jesus character is Hispanic. His father is Anglo, his mother is Mexican, an immigrant to the U.S. from Monterrey. And some people will be surprised at the setting of his story. The book ends up taking place throughout the U.S. and in part in Mexico. But it starts off in the Rio Grande Valley. And as I contemplated where I wanted it to be, Jesus was from Galilee, and Galilee was a poor area of Israel that nobody ever thought about. And so I thought, well, what are the equivalents in the U.S.? And to me, the 2 best equivalents perhaps were the Appalachian Mountains and the Rio Grande Valley. Being from Texas, I just thought, well, I'll just put it in the Rio Grande Valley. And so that's why the story is from there, and that's why the Jesus character turned out to be Hispanic. And some people might be surprised that the 12 people that he assembles around him, the ones that he trains, are a mix of both young men and young women. There's 7 young men and 5 young women. And they are all, it's a racially diverse group, but more Hispanic or Latino than anybody else, because that's the part of the country that it comes from. And so there's some creative decisions that I made that simply fit with the story. I wasn't really trying to make any political or theological points through them. They were just a natural part of how the story evolved. And so that's the way I wrote it.
Understood. And I can see why every choice you made is very logical and has to do with the, location and the time, and it makes sense. And that's what it really is all about. So that's great. So I'd love to kind of transition into the writing process for these books because, of course, they're very powerful books. There's a lot to think about it, especially, you mentioned yourself that fiction could be a vehicle to change lives. So that's a lot of responsibility there. I'm wondering, how do you balance such important work, the message of the book, without being too preachy and also making it entertaining in the way you have it? Do you have a strategy for that sort of balance? You do a very good job of it from what I've seen on the preview.
Well, that's a really good question. To me, it's essential when you're writing a faith-based book not to be preachy, and for the book not to come across as simply a platform for putting forth a certain point of view. In other words, it has to be an engaging story of its own right. And so if you can write a story that is engaging, that has interesting characters, that have character arcs that engage the reader, that the readers get emotionally invested in, and that has a development of the story that goes somewhere and the reader really wants to know, hey, what's going to happen, then in other words, if you have a really good story that somebody wants to read, it gives you a lot of freedom to throw things in as far as the message you want to get across, as long as it's done in such a way that is natural to the characters. And so I don't mind, having in one of my books a theological discussion about something, as long as we're talking about two characters who would naturally have that kind of discussion, as long as the discussion is genuinely interesting to the reader. But if the reader just has to slog through 6 or 7 pages of, some theological discussion because that's what the author wanted to talk about, to me, that's just a bad book. And so I've certainly written some books that I think accomplish that very well. Dinner with a Perfect Stranger is one. I think my latest book, One of Us, is one. Dinner's first sequel, A Day with a Perfect Stranger, where the Jesus character spends 2 plane flights sitting next to the man from Dinner with a Perfect Stranger. In A Day with a Perfect Stranger, he's spending time with this man's wife on an airplane. I think it works very well in that story. My first full-length novel, called A Last Christian, which was kind of a sci-fi based, AI based novel from 2010, I think worked very well in that regard. I've written some things that have worked less well. Some of them were published and didn't do that well because I think they overemphasized the message to the detriment of the story and simply weren't crafted well enough. And I've got numerous manuscripts in my desk drawer that fell prey to the same dynamic of being too preachy, not a good enough story, nobody wants to read it, and that's why they're sitting in my desk drawer. So, as a writer, you write some things that are really good, and you write some things that aren't as good, and that's just the way that's the nature of the beast.
Understood. Well, thank you for walking us through that. And I know it's a little bit of a challenging question I threw at you, but I think you answered it perfectly. And you gave us a good balance, a good idea of the balance that you're able to, put into these books.
Yeah.
So, that being said, I transition a little bit more into the book itself and kind of your writing routine. I'm wondering if you have any sort of rituals or practices that help you kind of tap into these spiritual themes. It's you in the creative mindset.
I am perhaps the world's least disciplined writer.
Okay.
I mean, I basically break the mold for every writing book that has what I think are really good suggestions about, okay, these are the ways you need to establish a writing routine and, get into the habit. And there are a whole lot of good suggestions out there, a whole lot of good books that have been written about it, half of which are sitting on my shelf. And I've been able to take some of their suggestions and incorporate them, I suppose, into my writing from time to time. But all of my efforts to become what someone might call a disciplined writer have just never amounted to anything. For the most part, I write when I want to. I write when I'm inspired. Sometimes write a whole lot of words in one day, and sometimes I don't. I suppose what that means is that sometimes I'm extremely productive and can produce material quickly, and sometimes it's a labor. At some point, you just have to push through, for sure. You can't just write when it's fun, but the process of crafting a creative work that somebody's actually going to want to sit down and invest their time in reading is interesting enough, at times even enthralling enough, to where I never find writing fiction to be something boring. I never write things that are not completely on my heart and that I'm really into and that I want to write. And so therefore, that writer's block, or I just don't want to write this anymore or whatever, doesn't hasn't tended to be something I've struggled with the exception of that one book, perhaps The Last Christian, which was a real slog to finally write the whole thing. But that was because there was so much research involved. The writing process and the editing process were so long, and the story itself was so involved. I kept having to reflow it, and it had about 220 different scenes, and so it was just a really complicated book. But I'm real pleased with the way it turned out, so it was worth it.
Understood. Well, hey, it's great to know that, despite the unconventional method on discipline, like you mentioned before, you made it happen. You've, created a great book, and it's out, and so many people have been impacted by it. And I'm sure you've had a lot of positive feedback from it too, and people's lives have been changed. There's no doubt about that. All this being said, though, you have these wonderful books out. You're changing lives, motivating people all over who pick them up. What's next for you, David? I'm sure you've got a whole other book kind of, in your mind right now that you might be working on.
Actually, I don't really have a fiction book that I'm thinking about, which is rare. I almost always have one. I have a nonfiction book that I'm planning on writing. I'm not sure when I'll get to it, maybe toward the end of the year. I don't really have a fiction book on my heart that I would love to plunge into. I'm not sure why. I wrote kind of a fairy tale type fiction book last fall that I might revisit and make some substantial changes to, and it might actually turn into something that I ended up producing. But maybe it's good for me to take a pause. My latest book, One of Us, hasn't yet caught on as much as I in book sales as much as I have wanted. It is about to be placed into some hands for the possibility of it becoming a movie or a streaming series that I'm very excited about. And so it would be kind of odd for a book that hasn't done a whole lot of print sales to nevertheless be produced into a movie. But I would certainly be happy with that. My real heart in writing is to not only enjoy the process, but to produce something that, as I said, will challenge people to think in different ways, will challenge their faith, and to really impact people's lives for the better. And so I look forward to the next story that kind of pops up for me. That typically is a really organic process. I don't go searching for storylines, but that hasn't happened yet. So I look forward to when it does.
Understood. Well, hey, I like that even though, you don't quite know what might be on the radar, you have some great prospects and you're looking forward to the film adaptation and everything else that you mentioned. It's always good to have something else on the table. It's whether it's a book or something else to continue promoting your message and your word and your brand. So I would just recommend that always to writers.
Yeah, for sure.
So all that being said, how can we get in touch with you if we want to learn more about you and stay up to date with the books and the films? Where's the best place to reach you and stay up to date?
Yeah, the easiest place to reach me is on my website, which is freewithgod.com, or I've got two websites. The other one's easy to remember. It's simply davidgregorybooks.com. So either website will work.
Well, perfect. We're going to put links to those in the description box of our podcast today, so you can go ahead and click on over if you're listening. Stay up to date, get in touch with David's work. He has some really powerful stuff here, and of course offers a lot of writing tips too, as you've learned on this podcast. So check it out, everybody. And as we begin to wrap up, David, I'm wondering, do you have any other bits of advice for the authors out there who are inspired by you today and might want to follow in your footsteps?
Yeah. Best advice I would give someone is work on your craft, do what you love doing, and don't expect necessarily to make a living writing books, because I've experienced a lot of success and I've experienced a lot of non-success. And, times when publishers would be thrilled to have me and times when nobody cared. And so writing is not something that is a particularly dependable thing to do from a career and career standpoint, unless you're the 1 in 100,000 that everybody buys your next book just because it's your next book. But I'm convinced that when you pursue what you love and it is really on your heart, I think it's true. Do what you love, the impact will follow. You really will impact lives by what you write. It may not be 1 million people, it may be 100. I think my story illustrates perhaps more than any that I've heard that, impact is something that such a large degree is outside of your control. But those people whom it does impact, their lives can genuinely be impacted and be changed in a really positive way. So I just encourage people to follow their passion and to enjoy the process.
That's incredible. I like that you said, when you love what you do, the rest will follow. That's a perfect way to describe it all, too. So I really appreciate all that. This is some amazing stuff that we can move on with today and apply to our own writing as soon as we've done listening to the podcast today. So I appreciate that. This is all some great material. And to all of our listeners out there, if you do want to dive deeper into what David is telling us, you can, like I said before, find all his books wherever the books are sold. Be sure to check out his website for resources. And all in all, David, just thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and showing us that sometimes the most powerful stories begin with simple intention to share hope with others. It's been a pleasure to meet you.
Well, thanks. Likewise. Thanks so much again for having me.
Of course. And everybody just remember that every expert was once a beginner, every bestseller started with a single word, and every mission begins with the courage to take that first step. Until next time, just keep on writing, keep on dreaming, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. We'll see you next time on the Authors on Mission podcast.
This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.